Dan. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm an economist from business school, as will become obvious. I am not a mathematician. So I'll be giving you a little bit of background on UK electricity market reform, and I'll talk about what that is and how it might be relevant, and also what's wrong with it. So this is some work I've been doing for the Japanese electricity industry, who are looking very closely at what's happening in the UK and hoping they might learn something from it. I'll talk a little bit about the background to UK electricity market reform, which sits nicely in the context of European reform that Pierre mentioned. I'll then talk about the elements of the wholesale market reform, because that's what electricity market reform is about, the reform of the wholesale market. And then I'll say a little bit at the end about impact. And I think there are a lot of interesting modelling questions, which I think you'll be able to pick out from the nature of the electricity market reform. Okay, some background. Of course, this is common background to all electricity markets in Europe. You hear everybody saying we need to increase investment. That is not what economists say, but it is what engineers say, and mathematicians, I suspect. So increase investment in order to get more decarbonisation. Rather slightly separate from that, of course, that is taken to mean we also need to increase renewables. Of course, we can decarbonise without renewables, but renewables are an important part of decarbonisation. And then we're also interested in maintaining security of supply at the same time as doing those things. In the retail market, of course, we've got some conflicting objectives, which are we want to keep prices down for customers, which isn't obviously consistent with increasing investment. We've got particular concerns around poorer customers who spend more than 10% of their income on electricity and gas in the UK. And we've got a concern about whether the market is actually competitive for retail customers or not. In terms of what energy policy attempts to do, and this is what my research is mostly on, it of course attempts to do the impossible, okay, which is we want a completely secure energy system, we want it to be completely clean, and we want it to be cheap. Okay, obviously those three things do not go together. And by the way, in the UK, we also want to encourage everybody to take action on climate change at the global level. Now, of course, doing your own thing at the national level isn't necessarily consistent with getting everybody to do the right thing at the global level, but we clearly have an important international commitment to promoting global decarbonisation in the UK. And then, of course, there are other things that are mentioned which are actually not necessarily part of these higher level objectives. The one I dislike the most is the idea that it's a good idea to subsidise renewables in order to create lots of jobs. The only jobs that are created when you subsidise renewables are jobs for engineers and mathematicians, and the odd economist, not for real people who need a job. Okay. So UK has got these very ambitious decarbonisation targets, as you know, partly because, of course, 1990 is a very nice year for the UK, when we privatised our electricity industry, and the coal in electricity began to drop very sharply. So we're on target for our 2012 target. We more than met that for greenhouse gas emissions, but we have got a very ambitious target for 2020 of minus 34%, which is looking a bit more challenging now. And actually greenhouse gas emissions went up in 2012 in the UK. And we've got this Climate Change Act, which is the game-changing piece of legislation in UK, which has an 80% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2050, introduces something called the Climate Change Committee, who are the central planning committee of the UK energy system, if you want to know who is doing the central planning. And they produce a 5-year carbon budget for the whole UK economy, and that results, as part of their work, they are suggesting that we need 90% decarbonisation of the electricity system by 2030 to meet this 2050 trajectory. And indeed, of course, these interim 5-year budgets that they produce 3 or 4 periods ahead, they've already got a target of 50% reduction on 1990 by the mid-2020s, which looks very, very challenging. So we've got a sort of near-term set of targets which are challenging. And of course, because electricity is first in line for decarbonisation, it's the electricity sector that's going to be hit first. Now, of course, economists did have a great idea. We do occasionally. And one great idea was to introduce the market for CO2 permits in the European Union, of which the electricity sector is a major participant, in fact the biggest single sector participating in the CO2 market. So that you needed to buy a CO2 permit in order to emit CO2 in the electricity sector, and this would set a price for CO2 because the quantity was restricted. And of course you can see the prices are rather volatile since 2005, and indeed I checked my latest statistic this morning, and apparently it's about €3 now. Now, of course, you talk to somebody who wants to build a nuclear power plant and ask them how high does the price of CO2 need to be in the European emissions trading system in order to build a new nuclear power plant, and they say somewhere north of €100 a tonne of CO2, and obviously the price at the moment is about 3, so you're not going to be building a nuclear power plant on the basis of this sort of price signal. So that doesn't appear to be working very well, even though it did seem like a good idea from a theoretical point of view. And partly it's not working very well because the quantity of CO2 permits was too high in the market, which is what's collapsed the price. UK has got ambitious renewables targets. These come from the European Union, so we've got a target in the UK of 15% of total energy from renewables, so that's transport and heat as well as the electricity sector. Has to be 15%, has to be from renewables. At the moment, the latest statistics were about 4%. That's a big gap, okay? And as I'll show in a second, it's not going to be closed by 2020, which is the target date. We currently have a support regime for electricity from renewables, which targets 15% of electricity from renewables by 2015-16, and we are making some slow progress towards that. There was a previous European target for 2010, which we missed, and conveniently that was replaced by the next set of targets in 2009. So clearly the policy on renewables is not working either, as well as the policy on CO2. So that's the background to electricity market reform. Of course, people consistently, and here's my rather woeful attempt at stochastic modelling. Here is the rise in the share of final energy coming from renewables. And if you just project that forward at the average rate at which it's been growing, you don't get anywhere near 15% by 2020. And if you even get very optimistic about the rate, and at the fastest improvement, you still don't get anywhere near the target, even though you consistently hear almost everyone saying that what drives current policy is a desire to meet this 2020 renewables target. It's still not in the bounds of reality, if you're an economist. Of course, it is possible that there'll be some stochastic event that will just get us up to here, but that is very, very, very unlikely. Okay. Another aspect of UK energy policy is clearly the lack of a high carbon price is disastrous for nuclear investment. We've got specific support regimes for renewables, but we need some way of supporting nuclear if we're going to make nuclear contribute to decarbonisation. So the question is, can we think of a way of supporting nuclear investment? Now, of course, the thing to remember about nuclear investment is nuclear investment has a woeful record in Europe of being very, very expensive. A lovely paper by Grubler, which shows that the cost of every French nuclear reactor gets more expensive as time goes on. So there's negative learning in nuclear rather than positive learning. And the two plants that are under construction at the moment in Europe are both massively over budget and over time. So the prospects don't look great for nuclear investment. Even if you could set up the subsidy regime in order to encourage nuclear investment, you've still got a cost problem. Of course, the other thing that people say, which would be lovely to have some proper modelling of, because there's not a lot of it around, is that the lights are going to go out, and that we've fundamentally got a capacity problem in the UK. And Ofgem did publish some projections with some rather dubious error bounds around them, which are strictly non-stochastic, suggesting that the amount of spare capacity by 2015-16 would be down below 5%, which would be considered to be a dangerous level and running high risk of a blackout at certain times. But Ofgem's projections contrast very sharply with National Grid's projections, which are much less pessimistic, and also the fact that the capacity margin, the amount of spare capacity at the peak, has been very low in the past, has increased very sharply as a result of the recession, and is now falling again back towards where it was in this earlier period at the beginning of the 2000s. So it's not altogether clear that the lights are going out as a result of a lack of investment in new capacity, but clearly there is a concern about that. Okay, so that's sort of background to wholesale market reform, or electricity market reform. So there are four elements of the electricity market reform proposals, which I'll go through in turn. There's a proposal to have fixed prices for low carbon generation, so-called CFD FITs, and I'll explain what those are, contracts for differences with feed-in tariffs. And that is supposedly to address the issue of things like the low price of carbon in the European emissions trading system. Then there's a carbon price support, which is an explicit set of taxes on fossil fuel for electricity generation. Then there's a capacity market to deal with the problem Pierre identified of fossil fuel plants shutting down as a result of more intermittent generation coming onto the market, subsidised intermittent generation. And then there's an emissions performance standard which will eliminate the ability to build high CO2 emitting power plants. And this legislation is currently in Parliament. It does represent a significant increase in the power of the Ministry, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, at the expense of independent regulation of electricity markets by Ofgem. So in a sense, there is obviously a conflict between these interventionist policies and policies which conventionally have been about simply making the market operate more efficiently. And indeed, from a sort of mathematical point of view, civil servants aren't that concerned about, don't talk to me about details of how markets actually work. I want to talk about the big picture of how we get more low carbon generation onto the electricity system. Okay. Now, in thinking about how these elements fit together, there is a logic behind them. So the idea of the CFD FIT is to offer a high price for electricity from low carbon investments, which will reflect both the energy content and the low carbon content, and to offer a certain price which will be high enough to support all types of low carbon generation, including nuclear. Okay, so that, if you like, is the centerpiece of the electricity market reform. Then, of course, to encourage switching between coal and gas, where gas is lower carbon dioxide emissions per kilowatt hour than coal, you put this tax on fuels for electricity generation in order to encourage switching between fossil fuels. And of course, it also has the nice characteristic that it does raise some revenue. It also drives up the price of the residual fossil fuel generation and reduces the cost of the first element. Then, of course, you might have a problem because you're driving off all the fossil fuel generation off the system, and you're worried about not having enough backup capacity to back up intermittent renewables such as wind. And that leads to the third element, which is to have a capacity market where you explicitly pay companies simply to have their power plants available to the system to back it up. So you're not just paying people for energy, you're paying them for capacity. So at the moment in the UK, we just have a set of energy markets. We don't have any capacity markets for electricity. And then, of course, if you're a Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth, well, this all sounds a bit too much economics in here. What if that doesn't work? Well, let's have something called the emissions performance standard, which is what the environmental NGOs do like, because that says, well, look, if this doesn't work, then we can simply have a standard which doesn't let us build any high CO2 emitting power plants. So there is a logic behind these four elements. The question is, what's the economics behind them? I'll say a little bit about that. Okay, so under the CFD FIT system, the government is going to contract for this low carbon electricity at fixed prices for a prolonged period. And there's a diagram. So here is the strike price that we written into the contract for difference. And then there'll be an energy market price, which is what the holders of CFD FITs will be getting when they sell their electricity into the energy market. And then they will get the difference between the strike price and the energy market price at any given time as their CFD FIT payment from the government. So they'll get a combination of the energy price up to here and then the CFD FIT price to top them up to the strike price at any time. Now, of course, there may be certain times of the year when the energy price is actually a bit higher than the strike price, in which case the generator will pay back the difference under the contract for difference. Of course, you might immediately see there's a problem with this, which is you have to, in the contract, specify which energy price you're talking about. And Pierre's already mentioned, well, there are several energy prices one can talk about. And it's also not clear whether the energy price will be around in 40 years' time at the expiry of your nuclear CFD FIT contract. So the argument for these CFDs is, well, the European emissions trading system gives rise, for CO2, gives rise to volatile carbon dioxide prices, which means the benefit of nuclear, in terms of saving, having to buy CO2 permits is volatile. And the energy price is volatile anyway. So people are discouraged from investing because of volatility of energy and carbon prices. Now, of course, we need to distinguish carefully between return and the variance of returns. So yes, it is true there is some variance in energy and carbon prices, but actually a simple hedging strategy would reduce a lot of the variance. The real issue, of course, is the price of energy, or the price of carbon is too low to support nuclear investment. Of course, just because you offer certainty to investors through a fixed strike price doesn't mean the risk has gone away. Of course, the customers who are picking up the CFD fit payments, they're exposed to the risk which is inherent in any CFD fit contract. The main risks, of course, around nuclear are construction risks and also cash flow appropriation risks. If government decides just to shut down all nuclear power plants because they're worried about safety, CFD fits aren't going to help you there. And as you just talk to German and Japanese nuclear companies, they'll tell you about how much money they've lost as a result of change of government policy. And if you're building a set of nuclear power plants, of course, you're not being de-risked from the future CFD fit price simply because you're offered a fixed price on your first nuclear power plant. So one would have to say that the CFD fit argument, which tends to be couched around reduction of risk, well, A, what risks are we talking about? And B, it's not about risk when it comes to nuclear power, it's about return. That's the problem. There are some practical issues with how you set up a CFD fit. What is the reference price over 40 years? Because it's written against an energy price, it's not clear whether these energy prices will be around in 40 years' time. There's been issues about who is the counterparty to the contract. So I've got a CFD fit for my nuclear output. Who is it with? And actually it's going to be with the government, not with other private energy companies. And will there be competition in the market for CFD fits? So the first nuclear power plant which will be getting a CFD fit is the only nuclear power plant at issue, and that's not going to be a competitive price setting process. That's just a negotiation at the moment. So there's worries about how competitive these strike prices are going to be. In the long term, the government imagines having a series of auctions which will be technology neutral. So CCS plants, nuclear plants, offshore wind, onshore wind will all be bidding in to supply low carbon electricity. They'll, in theory, be competing against one another. But the date at which they'll be competing against one another, that's to be determined. And in the short run, there'll be technology-specific strike prices for different types of low-carbon generation. What's going to be imagined to be the case is that the strike price will be a fixed index to inflation price, fixed for a minimum of 15 years, but if for nuclear, perhaps up to 40 years. Some discussion in the press about how long the nuclear strike price will be fixed for. Okay, so that's the first element. The second element is this carbon price support. And that has already been implemented. So this is a set of taxes on fossil fuels for electricity generation with the aim of increasing the effective price of CO2 in the electricity sector in the UK up to a target price which rises to £30 a tonne in 2020. Now, so we've got prices. Current EUA prices are €3 a tonne and falling, and could well be zero by 2020. But in the UK, they'll be £30 a tonne, which could easily be about €50 in nominal money. So this is a very substantial difference between the price of CO2 for the UK electricity sector versus the rest of Europe. And that's, of course, fundamentally, that's a tax policy, because it's a set of taxes on fossil fuels. And it's implemented just on electricity fossil fuels, so not on other types of fossil fuels in the energy system, particularly not on the burning of gas for heating. It's going to distort international competition in electricity across interconnectors, because you can't impose taxes on imports from the rest of Europe. So untaxed electricity will be coming through interconnectors, and there'll be huge incentives to build it more interconnection into the UK to sell, to essentially dodge the tax, which would otherwise be imposed on new power plants built in the UK. And the direct impact is quite large, even in the first year. It's ramping up gradually in terms of the target CO2 price, but the first year impact on household bills is quite substantial. So there are practical problems about whether the government will credibly keep increasing the tax towards its target price of CO2, because at some point, of course, the tax revenue will start to fall as the amount of fossil fuels used in electricity generation begins to drop off towards zero. It's already complicating the economics of things that do use fossil fuels and then hence compete with other low carbon forms of generation. There are going to be some messy exemptions for energy intensive industries, of course, who are also competing with other centres of industry in the rest of Europe, and who would just relocate to the Netherlands if there's high electricity prices in the UK as a result of the CPS. And of course, the international effect of something like the CPS, as well as something like the CFD FIT payments, if you massively decarbonise the UK electricity sector, of course, the UK electricity sector needs to buy less permits on the European emissions trading scheme for CO2, and the permit price falls even further in Europe. And indeed, you may completely undermine the emissions trading system, which of course may get us further away from a sort of global solution to greenhouse gas emissions. So then we come to the capacity mechanism. So the capacity mechanism is about paying generators for maintaining availability of plant. So because we're going to have lots of intermittent renewable generation, then the remaining fossil fuel plants, of course, as Pierre was pointing out, can't even expect to earn high prices some of the time. So that undermines their economics fundamentally, and that gives rise to perhaps the need for paying people for availability. There's some talk about how soon this will be implemented, but what's imagined to be the case is that it will be implemented next year, with auctions for capacity to be available in the winter of 2018-2019. But it's by no means clear that it will be introduced. It has to be deemed to be necessary to have this capacity mechanism. Now, in theory, of course, in markets, most markets, you don't need a capacity market. There are plenty of markets that are characterized by high, by capital-intensive production, where you've got to maintain expensive facilities to produce, things where the marginal cost is relatively low. And we don't pay them just to be hanging about in the economy. We usually just pay people for output, for energy. And in theory, of course, you don't need a capacity market as long as the energy price at those few times when energy is scarce can rise high enough to elicit some sort of capacity response and to incentivize some capacity to be around. And indeed, the issue in most electricity markets is that there are significant groups of consumers, usually households, who can't express their willingness not to be interrupted, not to be disconnected from the power system very well. Most other customers can express that and will hence pay, for the degree of energy security that they want, but households may not do that. And there are capacity markets around in the United States, because in the United States they are unwilling to let energy prices rise above a certain amount, and that has hence given rise to the need to have capacity markets, because they're not prepared to rely on energy markets to the extent that we have in Europe to provide enough capacity. Of course, it's not to say that there isn't some case for a capacity market, for a private capacity market, because there are some small intermittent generators who, of course, can get more for their electricity if they could guarantee their output, because it's difficult to predict what your output is going to be, as Pierre suggested. and hence you might get low prices for this rather stochastic output that you're offering. So of course, one solution is you simply sign a side contract with a fossil fuel generator to provide backup in order to smooth your output, in order to give you more certain output, which you can get a higher price for. And of course, you can do that privately. You don't need a formal capacity market for that. But if you, and indeed you can just have a portfolio of generation within a large company to do that. But a small independent renewable generator may not be able to do that and may need a formal capacity market in order to get that sort of backup capacity. There are practical problems. One of the practical problems of capacity markets is that governments intervene in capacity markets to keep the price of capacity down. So far from being a way of compensating fossil fuel generators for staying on the system, what it tends to be is a way of removing money from fossil fuel generators and other generators who just happen to have been on the system previously. And actually there are some cases in the US where state governments have deliberately licensed more capacity in order to drive down capacity market prices, thus undermining the whole argument for capacity markets. The other problem in the European Union, of course, is that you can't stop, it's not clear that you'll be able to stop people bidding in capacity across an international interconnector. And of course, this undermines the whole rationale for a capacity market, which is to maintain capacity within the UK. Whereas if people can just bid it in from northern France across an interconnector, then you don't necessarily get extra capacity inside the United Kingdom. So it's planned to be introduced, as I said, for 2018, 2019. Not everybody's going to get a capacity payment, so the CFD FIT holders won't necessarily get capacity payments because we don't want to pay them twice, and capacity payments will be volatile and pretty stochastic probably. And of course, demand side response and storage will be able to bid into the capacity market, and of course traditionally they're very cheap forms of capacity, negative capacity, which keep the price down. And then the final element is this emissions performance standard, which is designed to rule out new coal-fired power plants which don't have carbon capture and storage fitted to them, by setting a maximum emissions per kilowatt hour of 450 grams a kilowatt hour, which is above what a combined cycle gas turbine produces. So new CCGT plants would be okay, but supercritical coal plants, really efficient coal plants, would not be okay unless you had a 50% of it fitted with CCS. In theory, new peak coal plant would be okay if anybody wanted to build it, because the maximum emissions are calculated on a sort of base load factor calculation. Now, the problem that economics has with the emissions performance standard is, of course, this is a command and control response. I mean, if we're only interested in CO2 emissions, then we should just, be focused on CO2 emissions at the aggregate level, not at the individual plant level. That's got nothing to do with it, what's happening at the individual plant level. The problem, of course, that comes with introducing this apparently innocuous bit of the EMR is that, of course, you could tighten the standard very easily. Once you've got the premise that there is an emissions performance standard, then it would be easy just to reduce it to zero. So you can't emit any CO2 from a new power plant. And the problem with that, of course, is there are many countries that have tried to have these technology restrictions, which actually, of course, results in not being able to build anything at all and having very insecure power systems. So it's not a great addition to the EMR set of policies. Okay, some overall impact and analysis. So if you look at the documentation which DEC has produced, they suggest that as a result of these policies, bills are going to be lower. That seems a bit odd, because of course the whole point of them is that they'll be introducing more investment into the system, particularly new nuclear power plants, which are not cheap. The reason why bills appear to fall is because the baseline, the business as usual case, is this enhanced renewables obligation, which is the existing policy towards renewables beefed up beyond what anyone ever thought it was going to be beefed up to. The actual impacts, if you read the documents more carefully, are, well, prices are expected to go up and bills are expected to go up for everyone. So the bills go up by this amount, and there's some assumed demand reduction for households, and even taking out the impact of assumed higher gas prices on these expected absolute price rises, you still get the fact that most of the expected rise in the bill as a result of these policies is due to the EMR elements. So this is a very substantial effect, even in the government's own calculations. If, of course, the policies are actually successful in initiating more investment, which is not altogether clear that they might be. So I would want to, and here's some things that are easily testable, if you had enough data. So the CFD FIT payments seem to not be consistent with the theory of finance, because it isn't about variance of energy and carbon prices. It is about the absolute return. And it's not clear that you're really reducing the variance of the return substantially. The carbon price support set of taxes is at variance with a lot of optimal tax theory, which says you shouldn't tax intermediate goods into production because you'll distort the nature of production. The capacity markets are inconsistent with the theory of supply and demand, where you should just let the price rise to the point at which it clears the market. And if you do that, you don't need a capacity market. The emissions performance standard is not an economic instrument for reducing externalities in the production of CO2. Therefore, what's it doing there? There are lots of implementation problems. I think there are a lot of interesting modelling issues around what you expect your CFD FIT payment to actually be over a long period. There are lots of interesting modelling questions around the nature of the capacity market, and whether it will give rise to more capacity and more energy security. And this is going to be a very expensive policy if it is implemented fully, because each of the elements is expensive. And at the end of the day, it's not clear that you will reduce global temperature by anything. I mean, of course you won't reduce global temperature by anything, because if you're simply displacing emissions from the UK to the rest of Europe, then there is no net reduction in CO2 emissions. Hence, there is no impact on global temperature. Hence, there is no value to this policy. And of course, as I always like to say, the governments tend to be very unwilling to accept proper economic analysis of energy policy, but they seem to be very happy to accept what climate scientists say is necessary in order to reduce global temperature. Of course, the connection between these two things is not obvious in terms of if you want to reduce global temperature, that does not translate into a specific policy towards the electricity sector, except by a large number of logical steps, which need to be analysed fairly carefully. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, very much. Time for a quick question from Sean.
I love your talk. One thing, could you expand on how finance, is it really profitable to build nuclear given the huge variance of return? Would finance really solve that? It seems like such a costly, it's still, how does that really with such incredible uncertainty on costs, can you really resolve it with finance? I just don't. I don't understand.
Which way? Do you think the government can? Are you asking can the government?
There's uncertainty about another, disaster, worldwide disaster, so that it becomes politically infeasible to keep nuclear going. There's a danger of storage of waste that could become much more expensive in the future. There's so many risks seem so huge that I don't understand how financial instruments would solve that problem.
The answer, that's a good question. I mean, the answer is there must be some level of strike price which will compensate a nuclear investor. Okay, but I think you're right to ask the question: how high will that level be? Okay, so the answer is EDF are prepared to build the first nuclear power plant, in this next generation of nuclear power plants in the UK. So they say, as long as the strike price is high enough. But as you rightly point out, what will happen is you have to compensate them for a large number of risks, of which the volatility of the EU ETS price is a trivial aspect. The most important risk is whether the government will in 10 years' time tax my profits.
Absolutely.
Okay, when I built the nuclear power plant, the CFD payments per year are visible and they're hundreds of millions a year. It would be so tempting just to tax those profits, those operating profits. So, let alone if there's another nuclear disaster somewhere closer to home and you just announce overnight that you're shutting all nuclear power plants down. So, finance tells you that there is some price at which private investors would be compensated, but ultimately consumers are going to be paying that level of insurance that these private investors are asking for, and that is going to be very, very high.
Michael, I just read recently this book by Dieter Helm from Oxford, right? The Carbon Crunch, and he argues that the basic emission trading scheme is a nonsense, that we should have a carbon tax, and most importantly, import carbon tax, because basically what we are doing at the moment, we are importing CO2 from China, because that's where the production takes place. So by having carbon tax and import carbon tax, we would achieve the global effect as opposed to a local effect, which you have pointed out in your presentation. So what's your view on that?
Well, as you know, there are two issues with carbon taxes. One is the coordination problem. So the European Union tried to negotiate a European-wide carbon tax in the early 1990s, and basically, of course, that became subject to a sovereignty discussion whereby, as you know, many countries, including the UK, don't like fiscal, harmonisation. There may be more of an appetite for it now, but actually getting coordination on carbon taxes was impossible. So that's why they went for, instead of having a price coordination, they went for a quantity coordination. In theory, they can be equivalent, but it proved to be easier to get the quantity coordination. Now, of course, you are right that an individual country could try the imposing national carbon taxes with border tax adjustment, where you tax at the border the carbon content of the imports, and that would, if you got the tax rates right, which is very, very difficult, that would ensure that your national decarbonisation did not necessarily lead to any more carbon being produced overseas, because you could tax away the leakage effects. The problem, of course, of that is that falls foul of world trade rules, and as one of our colleagues, Carsten Neuhoff, argued that it could potentially be okay under world trade rules to impose border tax adjustments in the name of environmental charges, but in practice people would sue you because you hadn't calculated the carbon content of their imports correctly. So of course you'd end up being in endless disputes with your trading partners about, hang on, the carbon content of this soft toy from China is actually less than you think it is. and you'd have to correctly calculate the carbon content of everything that was being imported into your country, which is, that is a very extremely difficult task. So it looked like that a quantity restriction on CO2 emissions over a wide area, such as the European emissions trading system attempted to do, that was politically the most feasible way of coordinating global carbon reductions. And I think people still think that's probably the case.
Again, we have time for Andrew. You better have a quick question. You better be quick.
It is very quick, and it's slightly to do with your introduction rather than the main thrust of the talk. It's looking at the short-term capacity problems for, say, 2014, 2015. As I saw there, the off-gem graph you showed, showing that the margin was going down below 5%, is quite a recent graph. And you compared that and were quite optimistic with National Grid's view in 2011. It's quite a long time ago in terms of the energy market. It's before we had, I forget the exact figure, but it's between 12 and 15 gigawatts of capacity closed or mothballed. My understanding is that if you looked at the National Grid projection now, depending on the capacity we ascribe to sorry, I'm from National Grid. The capacity we ascribe to wind, we would be nowhere near as optimistic as we were in 2011. So it makes the whole of EMR, or whatever we do economically, that much more important.
I think I had another thing up on that slide, which was that National Grid had come out with a prediction a week after Ofgem's prediction, showing that actually the baseline capacity level was 2 or 3% better than Ofgem were predicting. So I think National Grid stuff is more optimistic than Ofgem, and I've had a long discussion with Ofgem recently about their presentation of statistics and the contrast with National Grid's presentation.
I think you'll find that National Grid's view is that in 2014 to 16 we go below 5% margin.
I think the other thing to say, of course, is we've had a prolonged period of uncertainty now, and in a sense, one of the issues is whether we've now got a self-fulfilling capacity problem. That actually, because everybody stopped investing because of EMR and because of the uncertainty of and nobody's invested for 2 years and nobody's going to invest for another 2 years, that actually, because we're now talking about 1 and 2%, that's an individual power plant could make a difference to that. So one CCGT delayed is enough to throw you above or below 5%. I think there's not necessarily much difference between us, but that doesn't mean I don't think that the whole exercise has been negative in producing this sort of uncertainty.
I just think it becomes more urgent.
Very quick.
Michael, could you please let us know where does the EMR place the UK in terms of achieving an internal market for electricity in Europe? I mean, we didn't hear a single mention on that, so I just wanted to know what's the reason.
Yeah, I think the answer is that the European Union is quite worried about the EMR because it is a go-it-alone strategy. It's essentially saying European policy hasn't worked towards decarbonising the electricity sector, and so I don't think they're that keen on the CFD fit, dump all the permits on the European emissions trading system, and they're certainly not that keen on the national capacity market, and they're certainly not keen on a carbon price support mechanism which will distort interconnector capacity. So I think it plays to the European view of the UK of we're throwing our toys out of the pram, and we're just not participating in this European Union thing. So I think they are worried about the UK sort of absenting itself from the single market.
All right.
Okay, we can pass on Michael. Interesting things there for later. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.